There was a cafe I used to frequent in Muscat, right on the Corniche, where the old Omani merchants gathered at dusk to drink karak chai and argue about the price of frankincense. They always said the same thing: the ocean remembers what the land forgets. I never fully understood that phrase until the third week of March 2026, when two ballistic missiles launched from somewhere inside Iran arced across the Arabian Sea, crossed the equator, and traveled over 4,000 kilometers toward a tiny coral atoll most people had never heard of, Diego Garcia. The missiles did not reach their target. One malfunctioned in flight, the other was intercepted, but in the grammar of geopolitics, the message was never the explosion, the message was the trajectory. Let me be very clear about what happened because mainstream commentary largely missed the point. The conventional narrative framed this as a failed attack. Iran shot and missed. Move on. But that reading is dangerously shallow. What Iran demonstrated on that Friday morning was not a military strike, it was a strategic revelation. For decades, Tehran had maintained a self imposed ballistic missile range limit 2,000 kilometers. That was the ceiling Western defense planners used in their models, their war games, their congressional briefings, and in one launch, that number was erased. Diego Garcia sits roughly 4,000 kilometers from Iran's coastline, double the declared range. Every assumption the Pentagon, NATO, and the European defense establishment built their posture on was rendered obsolete in a single morning. Now, before we go further, I want you to understand what Diego Garcia actually is, because this is not just an island. This is the hidden architecture of American global power. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this: Diego Garcia was never supposed to be visible. It was designed to be invisible, a floating aircraft carrier existing on no tourist map, in no public imagination. The Pentagon once described it as an all but indispensable platform for security operations across the Middle East, South Asia, and East Africa. The origin story reads like a Cold War thriller. In the late 1950s, the US Navy developed the strategic island concept, a plan approved by the Joint Chiefs in 1960 to stockpile remote islands for future military use. Think of it as a real estate acquisition strategy for global dominance. The Navy needed an Indian Ocean location far from any newly independent nation that might object, far from journalists and cameras. They found the Chagos Archipelago, British colonial holdings. At its center, Diego Garcia, shaped, as the Navy noted with unintentional poetry, like a footprint. They called it the footprint of freedom. But freedom for whom? Between 1967 and 1973, the British government, at Washington's request, forcibly removed the entire population of Diego Garcia. Every man, woman, child. The Chagosians, descendants of plantation workers who had lived there for generations, were loaded onto ships and deposited in Mauritius with virtually nothing, their homes demolished, their plantations destroyed, all done in secret under a bureaucratic fiction classifying the Chagosians not as a settled population but as contract laborers. The UN later called it one of the great injustices of the post-colonial era. The Chagosians have never been allowed to return. Now we're getting to the most surprising part of this story, because what was built on top of that erased community is arguably the most strategically important piece of real estate in the entire American military network outside the continental United States. Diego Garcia today hosts approximately 2,500 personnel, overwhelmingly American. It has a runway long enough for B-52 Stratofortresses, B-1 Lancers, and B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the holy trinity of American strategic air power. It has a deep water port servicing aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. It houses pre-positioned ships loaded with enough equipment and ammunition to supply an entire Marine Expeditionary Brigade. It operates satellite tracking stations, signals intelligence facilities, and deep space surveillance systems. In 2008, the US acknowledged Diego Garcia had been used for CIA rendition flights. The island is America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean. Every major American military operation of the last 3 decades was staged, at least partly, from this atoll. During the Gulf War in 1991, B-52s flew over 200 combat missions from Diego Garcia. Each one a grueling 17-hour round trip, dropping more than 800,000 tons of ordnance on Iraqi positions in Kuwait. After September 11, 2001, when countries like Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia refused to allow their territory for strikes on Afghanistan, it was Diego Garcia that filled the gap. B-1s, B-2s, and B-52s launched from that coral runway to hammer Taliban positions in a campaign that literally could not have happened without this island. During the 2003 Iraq invasion, prepositioned ships from Maritime Prepositioning Squadron 2 sortied from Diego Garcia's lagoon to deliver an entire brigade's worth of equipment to the Persian Gulf. And in 2025, when the US escalated its campaign against Yemen's Houthi forces, nuclear-capable B-2 Spirit bombers were deployed to Diego Garcia for regional operations. If you want to understand the American empire's operating system, forget the aircraft carriers and the Pentagon briefings, look at Diego Garcia. It is the machine room, the engine beneath the deck, the place where power is generated before it is projected. This is the target Iran chose to message, not a random forward operating post in Kuwait or Bahrain, the nerve center, the logistics backbone, the one installation the United States built its entire Indian Ocean strategy around for half a century. And the fact that Tehran chose this target, rather than something closer and easier to hit, tells you everything about what Iran was trying to communicate. The real breaking point starts right here, because the implications go far beyond Diego Garcia itself. Consider the geometry: 4,000 kilometers from Tehran. Draw a circle with that radius. Every NATO base in Turkey, including in Kirlik, falls inside. Every US facility in the Gulf. The British sovereign base at Akrotiri in Cyprus, which had already been struck by Iranian drones. Romania, which allowed the US to station refueling planes and surveillance equipment. And this sent a particular chill through Whitehall, London itself. As one analyst at the Doha Institute observed, reverse the direction of those missiles, and they reach the British capital. That single observation reframed the entire war for Europe. Until Diego Garcia, the conflict was understood in European capitals as a Middle Eastern problem. Terrible but geographically contained. The Diego Garcia launch shattered that comfortable fiction. Every European government that had allowed US military basing was suddenly doing new math. The British had agreed to let American forces operate from Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford. Romania provided access for refueling and surveillance. France dispatched Rafale jets. All decisions made under the assumption Iran's missiles could not reach them. That assumption was now in question. And here is where the story acquires its most ironic dimension. Iran denied the whole thing. Tehran's spokesman called the allegations an Israeli false flag. NATO's Secretary General stated the alliance could not confirm Israel's claim. The British Defense Secretary confirmed 2 missiles were launched, but said neither got close to the island. The cognitive dissonance was almost poetic. Iran says it did not happen. NATO says it cannot confirm. The UK says it happened but was not close. Yet every defense planner from Brussels to Bucharest was quietly updating threat models, because the point was never whether the missiles hit. The point was that they flew. Now we're getting to the most surprising part of this story, because behind Diego Garcia lies a much larger chessboard, and the pieces have been moving for years. For decades, Iran declared its missile program capped at 2,000 kilometers. Not a technical limitation, but a political decision. The Supreme Leader imposed the range limit in 2017, apparently to reassure the international community. Western intelligence mostly accepted this, though suspicions lingered about Iran's space program. The US Defense Intelligence Agency assessed in 2025 that Iran could develop a viable ICBM by 2035. Diego Garcia compressed that timeline dramatically. What intelligence thought was a 2035 problem was a 2026 reality. The connection is straightforward. Iran had been developing space launch vehicles, civilian rockets for orbiting satellites, but space launch vehicles and ballistic missiles share the same fundamental technology. The rocket putting a satellite into orbit and the one delivering a warhead across 4,000 kilometers are, in engineering terms, very close cousins. What Iran revealed is that its space capability was always dual use. The oldest trick in the missile proliferation playbook, North Korea did it, India did it, even the United States did it in the 1950s when the Atlas served simultaneously as America's first ICBM and first orbital vehicle. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. Diego Garcia did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader capability revelation that upended Western strategic assumptions. Since February 28th, Iran launched over 500 ballistic and naval missiles and nearly 2,000 drones. 60% targeted U.S. positions. Iranian missiles struck the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain multiple times, causing extensive damage. 6 Army reservists were lost in a drone attack in Kuwait. Kuwait's own air defenses accidentally downed 3 U.S. F-15E Strike Eagles. 2 Iranian Su-24 bombers flying at treetop level came within minutes of Al Udeid, the largest U.S. base in the Middle East, before Qatari F-15s intercepted them. At sea, the IRGC effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Any vessel attempting transit would be targeted. They were not bluffing. Oil tankers were set ablaze. The IRGC claimed it struck 3 U.S. and British oil tankers. Commercial shipping companies Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd suspended all Middle East routes. Brent crude surged past $120, reaching $107 on the day I recorded this. The IEA described this as the greatest global energy and food security challenge in history. Consider the scale. The 1973 Arab oil embargo removed 4.5 million barrels per day from global supply. The Hormuz closure removed 20 million. This is not a comparable event. It is an event of a completely different magnitude. And it was not just about the strait. In one of the war's most haunting episodes, a U.S. submarine torpedoed the Iranian frigate Iris Dena in the Indian Ocean, about 40 nautical miles south of Sri Lanka. The vessel was returning from the International Fleet Review 2026 in India, a multilateral naval exercise that required participating ships to carry no ammunition. The U.S. likely knew the Dena was defenseless since it also sent a maritime patrol aircraft to participate in the same exercise. 104 Iranian sailors were lost, 32 injured. It was the first ship sunk by a submarine in active combat since the Falklands War and the first by an American submarine since World War II. The symbolism was devastating. A warship eliminated while returning from an exercise dedicated to international maritime cooperation. Diego Garcia was not just a military message. It was an energy message. The base sits astride the Indian Ocean sea lanes connecting the Gulf to Asia, the same lanes through which Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and South Korean oil imports travel. Iran signaled it could threaten not only the oil's source, but also the infrastructure protecting its transit. If Diego Garcia were neutralized, the entire American naval architecture in the Indian Ocean, escort convoys, maritime security, tanker insurance frameworks, would be compromised. The economic consequences would ripple from Singapore to São Paulo. This connects Diego Garcia to kitchen tables in Manila, Dhaka, Karachi, and Bangkok. The Philippines declared a national emergency over energy supply. Bangladesh, dependent on Qatar for 72% of its LNG, faced acute shortages. Pakistan, already running a structural gas deficit, was scrambling for alternatives. India saw costs spike from both supply loss and Brent-indexed price surge. A dual shock hammering the rupee to record lows and forcing cooking fuel rationing. Fertilizer prices surged by 20 to 30% globally, a direct threat to planting seasons from the American Midwest to the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. The Dallas Fed projected global GDP growth falling by 2.9 percentage points. The world was not just watching a war, it was experiencing its metabolic consequences in real time. The real breaking point starts right here. Because Diego Garcia also exposed something Western intelligence has been reluctant to discuss: the invisible support infrastructure Russia and China built around Iran. When senior American officials confirmed Russia was providing Iran with sensitive intelligence, including precise locations of US warships and aircraft, they exposed a new kind of warfare: not tanks and carrier groups, but radar beams, satellite feeds, encrypted coordinates. Russia's advanced surveillance network, including the Canopus V satellite, transferred to Iranian use under the code name Kayam, provides round-the-clock optical and radar imagery. For Iran, this is not a supplement. It is the nervous system of its precision strike doctrine. China's role is equally significant. Beijing supplied advanced YLC-8B radar systems capable of detecting stealth aircraft. Iran was reportedly nearing a deal for 50 CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles. China's export variant, capable of Mach 3, sea-skimming at altitudes that compress a ship's reaction window to seconds. Military analysts call them carrier terminators. Both the USS Abraham Lincoln and Gerald R. Ford were operating within engagement range. The irony is exquisite. For years, the United States provided Ukraine with targeting intelligence used against Russian positions, including, reportedly, locations near the Russian president's own residences. Russia watched, Russia learned, and Russia returned the favor. As one senior US commander acknowledged, the electromagnetic spectrum has become the new battlefield. Whoever controls the spectrum controls the fight. In the Gulf today, that dominance is no longer one-sided. And this trilateral deepening is perhaps the war's greatest strategic paradox. By attacking Iran during active negotiations, Washington did not weaken the Russia-China-Iran axis, it hardened it. What was once cautious coordination is solidifying into what analysts at the Total Peace Institute described as structured alignment, reinforced by energy interdependence, expanding defense cooperation, and increasingly coordinated diplomatic positions. Russia trades hydrocarbons for Chinese capital and diplomatic cover. China's 2026-2030 development blueprint, submitted to the National People's Congress just weeks before the war, reflects renewed momentum for the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, a clear signal that Beijing intends to insulate its economy from Middle Eastern volatility by deepening energy ties with Moscow rather than depending on Gulf supply routes that can be disrupted by American military action. And Russia, here is the punchline that no one in Washington wants to hear, which built its 2026 federal budget on oil price assumptions of roughly $60 per barrel, found itself the accidental beneficiary of $120 crude. The windfall provided Moscow with precisely the capital it needed to sustain its military operations in Ukraine. The American war on Iran was, in effect, financing the Russian war in Europe. You could not script a more devastating critique of strategic incoherence if you tried. This is the kind of blowback that Halford Mackinder would have understood instinctively. The kind that happens when you try to fight on the Rimland and the Heartland simultaneously against adversaries who have learned to make your wars work for them. Meanwhile, the BRICS bloc, which was supposed to represent the institutional framework of the emerging multipolar order, found itself paralyzed. Almost a month into the war, BRICS failed to issue a unified position. India, the 2026 chair, had signed a special strategic partnership with Israel just 2 days before the strikes began. Prime Minister Modi was photographed embracing Netanyahu in Jerusalem. Naturally, New Delhi refused to condemn the attack on its own BRICS partner. Brazil and China condemned it. South Africa hesitated. The bloc's very paralysis became the story, a reminder that multipolarity, when tested by actual war, reveals the fault lines between rhetoric and interest. Iran, for its part, offered BRICS countries safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, a move that signaled something profound. Access to critical energy routes would increasingly be mediated through alternative political alignments rather than Western-dominated mechanisms. The old order said, the US Navy guarantees freedom of navigation for everyone. The new order says, who your friends are determines whether your tankers get through. Now we're getting to the most surprising part of this story. Because Diego Garcia is ultimately not about a coral atoll, It is about the end of strategic impunity. For 50 years, America operated on the assumption that its forward bases were untouchable. Diego Garcia was the ultimate expression, deliberately built in one of Earth's most remote locations beyond conceivable threat. The geography was the defense. Iran proved geography is no longer sufficient. In a world of space launch derived ballistic systems, satellite guided targeting, and great power intelligence sharing, distance has been compressed. The island meant to be unreachable has been reached. If Tehran can demonstrate 4,000-kilometer capability, what does that mean for Guam, for Ramstein, for Yokosuka? The entire theory of forward deployed American power rests on base security. Diego Garcia suggests that assumption needs revisiting. The Chinese are certainly taking notes. Beijing has studied American military operations with meticulous attention, and the 2026 war provides a live-fire laboratory. How do carrier groups operate under sustained missile attack? What happens when air defense systems are saturated? How does the logistics chain function when forward bases degrade? These are not academic questions for a military preparing for potential conflict over Taiwan. Every vulnerability Iran exposes, China catalogs, and the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is the civilizational dimension. The Chagossians have spent 50 years fighting to return. The International Court of Justice ruled in 2019 that Britain's separation of the Chagos archipelago was unlawful. The UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in support. Britain ignored both. In 2024, London agreed to transfer sovereignty to Mauritius while retaining a 99-year lease on Diego Garcia. But the current administration complicated the deal, explicitly linking the island to the military buildup against Iran. The sovereignty of an entire archipelago became a footnote in war logistics. The symbolism is almost too perfect, an island stolen from its inhabitants to project imperial power, a base built on community erasure, and now missiles flying toward it from 4,000 kilometers, launched by a nation claiming defense of sovereignty against imperial aggression. 3 stories, 3 grievances, converging on the same coral atoll. This is the architecture of empire, not just aircraft carriers and satellite dishes, but layered histories of displacement, extraction, and control. Diego Garcia could not exist without removing the Chagossians. The Indian Ocean posture could not exist without Diego Garcia. The war on Iran could not be prosecuted without that posture. Each layer depends on the one below. Pull one out, and the edifice trembles. The war itself was launched during what Oman's foreign minister described as active and serious negotiations. Iran had agreed to downgrade its enriched uranium. A deal was within reach. Then the surprise strikes began. The supreme leader eliminated in the opening hours, along with family members, in a strike on his compound. The diplomats were talking peace. The bombers were already in the air. Today, the Strait of Hormuz remains shut. Oil exceeds $100. The ECB has frozen rate cuts. Germany, the UK, and Italy face recession. The Philippines has declared emergency. 2,000 vessels sit stranded. Negotiations have devolved into incompatible demands. America's 15 points versus Iran's 5 conditions. Washington wants Tehran to dismantle its missiles, abandon allies, recognize Israel. Tehran wants guarantees, compensation, and sovereignty over Hormuz. The gap is not a gap, it is an abyss. The diplomatic track runs through Islamabad. Pakistan relays messages. China says talking is better than fighting, but trust is shattered. Iran notes the US deploys paratroopers while claiming to negotiate. You are negotiating with yourselves, the Iranian military taunts. Meanwhile, strikes intensify. Israel hitting Isfahan infrastructure, taking out the IRGC Navy commander who architected the Hormuz blockade. Hezbollah firing rockets on northern Israel around the clock. Lebanon reporting over 1,000 casualties since March attack. The war is not winding down, it is widening. And in the middle of it all sits Diego Garcia, silent, remote, a coral atoll shaped like a footprint, planted in the Indian Ocean by an empire that believed its reach would never be challenged. The footprint is still there, the base still operational, the bombers still flying, but something fundamental has shifted. The island beyond reach has been shown to be within range. The ocean that was an American lake is becoming contested water. The architecture of unipolar power is encountering friction it was never designed to handle. This is what systemic shift looks like, not dramatic collapse, but gradual accumulation. A missile that misses but proves capability. A strait that closes and sends oil past 100. A Chinese radar that lets an Iranian jet threaten the largest US base in the Middle East. A Russian satellite revealing where American ships are. A BRICS bloc that cannot issue a statement but whose paralysis reflects the impossibility of old world consensus. The question that remains, the one that will define the next chapter, is whether the architects of American power understand what Diego Garcia just told them. The message from 4,000 kilometers was not, "We can hit you." The message was, "The world you built is changing. The distances you relied on have collapsed. The nations you sanctioned and the economies you disrupted are no longer willing to bear the costs of your primacy in silence." That is a message no interceptor can shoot down. The ocean remembers what the land forgets, and the footprint of freedom is discovering that the ocean has a memory of its own, a memory of displaced peoples and broken promises and self-imposed limits that turned out to be illusions, a memory of empires that built bases on coral and assumed the tide would never rise. The tide is rising. And the question I leave you with is the one every empire eventually confronts but never answers in time. When the periphery reaches the center, when the missiles cross distances you thought were safe, when the invisible architecture becomes visible to everyone, what do you do? Do you build more bases, deploy more bombers, or do you finally ask, is this sustainable? Is this just? And if it is neither, then what comes next? That is the question, and the world is watching to see who answers it first. Well,